The courtroom went silent the moment she walked in, and everyone knew exactly who she was. If you believe justice should be blind to power and privilege, hit that like button right now, because what happens next will restore your faith in the system. Madison Hartwell didn't just enter Department 7 of the Superior Court, she owned it. Or at least that's what her designer heels clicking against the marble floor seemed to announce to everyone present. The 23-year-old daughter of Governor Richard Hartwell moved through the gallery like royalty reviewing her subjects. Her Chanel sunglasses perched on her head despite the overcast morning, her $1,000 handbag swinging carelessly from her wrist. Behind her trailed her attorney, Marcus Pemberton, a shark in a $10,000 suit whose law firm had made careers out of making problems disappear for people who could afford their retainer. The gallery was packed, reporters in the back rows, cameras positioned at every permitted angle, and citizens who had waited in line since 5 in the morning just to witness what everyone was calling the trial of the decade. Judge Elias Monroe sat at the bench, a mountain of judicial integrity carved from 63 years of unwavering principle. His silver hair was immaculately combed, his black robe pressed and dignified, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the room without seeming to move at all. The overhead lights cast long shadows across the oak paneling, making the courtroom feel less like a legal venue and more like a cathedral of justice. The American flag hung motionless in the corner, and the state seal behind the judge's bench seemed to watch over the proceedings with brass solemnity. The air conditioning hummed softly, but it did nothing to cool the tension that had been building in this room for 3 weeks. This was day 1 of the sentencing phase, and everyone knew that what happened here would reverberate far beyond these walls. The charges were severe: vehicular manslaughter, DUI causing death, leaving the scene of an accident, and obstruction of justice. 3 months earlier, Madison Hartwell had left an exclusive political fundraiser at the governor's mansion, climbed behind the wheel of her Mercedes AMG GT, and proceeded to drive home despite having a blood alcohol content nearly 3 times the legal limit. Security footage from a convenience store 2 miles from the mansion showed her vehicle weaving between lanes, crossing the center line twice, and accelerating through a red light. 12 minutes after leaving that parking lot, Madison's car struck 54-year-old Robert Chen as he crossed the street in a marked crosswalk, returning home from his night shift at the hospital where he worked as a janitor. Robert was thrown 30 feet by the impact. Madison never touched her brakes. She drove another 1.5 miles before pulling into her luxury apartment complex, parking in her assigned spot, and going upstairs to bed. Robert Chen died on the pavement, his lunchbox scattered across the intersection, his phone still clutched in his hand with a text message to his wife half-written, "On my way home. Love you." He left behind a wife of 32 years, 2 adult children, and 4 grandchildren he would never see grow up. He had immigrated to this country with nothing, worked 3 jobs to put his kids through college, and never missed a day of work in 15 years at the hospital. His co-workers described him as the kindest man they'd ever known, someone who learned everyone's name, who always asked about their families, who volunteered to work the holidays so younger staff could be with their children. Madison's initial response to being arrested 6 hours after the accident, once police had tracked her vehicle through traffic cameras and found her sleeping in her apartment, was to call her father before calling a lawyer. Her second response was to refuse a breathalyzer test. Her third was to ask the arresting officers, "Do you have any idea who I am?" Security footage from the police station showed her in the holding cell, not crying, not showing remorse, but on her phone texting her friends, "This is so ridiculous. Dad's going to have someone's badge for this." The trial had been a circus. Pemberton had argued that the traffic camera footage was unreliable, that the witnesses were mistaken, that the forensic evidence had been contaminated, that his client's constitutional rights had been violated in 17 different ways. He'd filed 42 motions, deposed 60 witnesses, and turned what should have been a straightforward case into a 3-week marathon of legal maneuvering. But the jury had seen through every tactic. After only 4 hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts. That was 2 days ago. Now came sentencing, and everyone in this courtroom knew this would be the real battle. Judge Monroe looked down at the papers before him, though everyone suspected he'd memorized every word already. His face was unreadable, carved from granite, his hands folded on the bench with the patience of someone who had seen every trick, every performance, every manipulation in 4 decades on the bench. He had presided over gang trials, mob cases, corporate fraud, and everything in between. He had sent billionaires to prison and exonerated the wrongly accused. He had been threatened, bribed, and pressured, and none of it had ever moved him 1 inch from his principles. The attorneys in the city called him the immovable object. The criminals called him something else entirely. But everyone respected him, because everyone knew that in Department 7, the only thing that mattered was the truth. "Mr. Pemberton," Judge Monroe's voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. "Your client may stand for sentencing." Madison rose slowly, and even now, even at this moment, there was something theatrical about her movements. She smoothed her cream-colored dress, tossed her highlighted hair over her shoulder, and stood beside her attorney with her chin slightly elevated, her expression not quite neutral, somewhere between boredom and defiance. She didn't look at the prosecutor's table, where Robert Chen's widow sat with her children, their eyes red from crying, but their backs straight with dignity. She didn't look at the jury box, though it was empty now. She looked straight ahead at Judge Monroe with something that might have been confidence or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell the difference. "Your Honor," Pemberton began, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "Before you proceed with sentencing, I believe there are some factors this court must consider. Miss Hartwell is a first-time offender who killed a man and drove away," Judge Monroe interrupted, his voice soft but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Continue, counselor, but choose your words carefully." Pemberton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Miss Hartwell has no prior criminal record. She's a graduate of Yale University, a productive member of society, someone with deep family connections and community ties. She has expressed remorse. Has she?" The judge's eyes never left Madison. "I've read the pre-sentencing report, Mr. Pemberton. I've reviewed the transcripts of her police interview, her depositions, her testimony. I've seen no evidence of remorse. What I've seen is evidence of entitlement, of believing that the rules that govern ordinary citizens don't apply to her." The courtroom was so quiet that the sound of someone shifting in their seat in the back row seemed thunderous. Madison's expression flickered for just a moment, a crack in the facade. But then her attorney leaned in and whispered something to her, and the mask returned. "Your Honor," Pemberton pressed on, "the state is recommending 15 years, which in a case like this, given the defendant's background and circumstances, is simply excessive. We're asking the court to consider probation with community service, perhaps a suspended sentence with mandatory counseling and probation." Judge Monroe let the word hang in the air like smoke from a fire. "Mr. Pemberton, your client got behind the wheel of a 2-ton vehicle while intoxicated, struck and killed a man in a crosswalk, and drove away from the scene. She then attempted to conceal her involvement, refused to cooperate with the investigation, and has shown no genuine remorse for her actions. And you're asking me to give her probation? With respect, Your Honor, my client's father is Governor Richard Hartwell, and the scrutiny this case has received has already been punishment in itself." "Stop!" The single word from Judge Monroe's mouth hit like a gavel strike. "Stop right there, counselor. What you just said is precisely the problem. You want me to consider who your client's father is. You want me to factor in her family connections when determining her sentence?" The judge leaned forward slightly, his eyes boring into Pemberton. "In my courtroom, Mr. Pemberton, it doesn't matter if your father is the governor or a grocery clerk. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, connected or anonymous. The only thing that matters is what you did, and what the law requires." Madison's face flushed red. Her hands, which had been relaxed at her sides, curled into fists. And then, in a moment that would replay on every news channel for the next month, she spoke without her attorney's permission. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice cutting through the courtroom like broken glass. "You know who my father is. This court, this judge. Everyone in this building works for my father. He signs your paychecks. He appoints judges like you. You think you can actually send me to prison? Do you have any idea what happens when I make one phone call?" The gallery erupted in gasps and murmurs. Reporters frantically scribbled in notebooks. The court reporter's fingers froze over her machine for a split second before continuing. Pemberton grabbed Madison's arm, his face pale, hissing, stopped talking under his breath, but she jerked away from him. Judge Monroe's expression didn't change. He sat perfectly still, letting the noise wash over the courtroom before raising one hand in a gesture that commanded instant silence. When he spoke, his voice was even quieter than before, which somehow made it even more devastating. "Miss Hartwell," he said, each word measured and precise, "let me educate you about how this works, because clearly no one has bothered to do so before now. Your father is the governor of this state. That is true. He has significant power and influence. That is also true. But here's what you don't seem to understand. He does not sign my paycheck because I am not an employee of the executive branch. I am a member of the judiciary. I was elected by the people of this county, and I answer to the Constitution, to the law, and to my conscience. Your father cannot hire me. He cannot fire me. He cannot promote me or demote me. He cannot influence my decisions, not through phone calls, not through pressure, not through any means at all. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Madison's face had gone from red to white. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. "Furthermore," Judge Monroe continued, his voice like steel wrapped in silk, "you've just admitted in open court, on the record, with witnesses and reporters present, that you believe the justice system is corrupt, that you believe judges can be influenced by political connections, and most damning of all, that you believe you can make a phone call and escape the consequences of killing a man. That statement alone tells me everything I need to know about your character, about your remorse, or lack thereof, and about what kind of sentence is appropriate here." He pulled a document toward him, though everyone could tell he wasn't really reading it. He was giving Madison time to absorb what was happening, time to understand that the ground had just disappeared beneath her feet. "Robert Chen," the judge said, his voice softening slightly with respect for the dead, "was 54 years old. He came to this country 35 years ago with a dream of giving his children a better life. He worked as a janitor at Memorial Hospital, a job he took with pride and dignity. He worked nights so he could spend days helping his wife run their small grocery store. He had never been arrested, never been sued, never caused anyone a moment of trouble. By every account I've read, he was beloved by everyone who knew him. He had 4 grandchildren, and when he died, he was carrying a birthday card in his jacket pocket for his youngest granddaughter's 5th birthday party that weekend. He never got to give her that card." The courtroom was so quiet that people seemed afraid to breathe. In the front row, Mrs. Chen wiped tears from her eyes while her daughter held her hand. "Miss Hartwell," Judge Monroe continued, his eyes never leaving the defendant, "you took that man's life. You didn't just make a mistake. You made a choice. You chose to drink. You chose to drive. And when you hit Mr. Chen, you chose to keep driving. You chose yourself over decency, over law, over basic human compassion. And even now, standing in this courtroom after being convicted by a jury of your peers, you show no remorse. You show arrogance. You invoke your father's name as if it's a magic shield that protects you from consequences." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. "The state has recommended 15 years. Your attorney has asked for probation. I'm going to tell you both what I've decided, and I'm going to explain exactly why." He straightened in his chair, his voice taking on the formal tone of official judgment. "Miss Madison Hartwell, you have been convicted by a jury of vehicular manslaughter, DUI causing death, leaving the scene of an accident, and obstruction of justice. The sentencing guidelines for these crimes, taken together, allow for a range between 8 and 25 years of incarceration. I have considered your age, your lack of prior criminal record, and yes, even the letters of support your attorney submitted on your behalf. I have also considered the nature of your crime, the impact on the victim's family, and most significantly, your complete lack of remorse and your statement here today that demonstrates you believe you are above the law." Madison's knees seemed to buckle slightly. Pemberton put a hand on her elbow to steady her. "It is the judgment of this court," Judge Monroe declared, "that you be sentenced to 20 years in state prison for the crime of vehicular manslaughter, to be followed by 5 years for leaving the scene of an accident, 3 years for obstruction of justice, and 2 years for DUI causing death. These sentences are to run consecutively, not concurrently. That is a total of 30 years of incarceration." The courtroom exploded. Reporters rushed for the doors to file their stories. Madison collapsed into her chair, her face completely white, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish out of water. Pemberton looked like he'd been struck by lightning, immediately standing and saying, "Your Honor, we will appeal this sentence." "You have that right," Judge Monroe acknowledged calmly. "But let me be clear about something, Mr. Pemberton, and I want everyone in this courtroom to hear this. This sentence is not about punishing Miss Hartwell because of who her father is. It's about holding her accountable despite who her father is. If she were anyone else, if she were a waitress or a teacher or an accountant, and she had shown the same lack of remorse, the same arrogance, the same contempt for the court and for the victim, I would give her the exact same sentence. In fact, the only reason she's not receiving the maximum of 40 years is because I do acknowledge she's a first-time offender." He turned his attention back to Madison, who was staring at him with tears streaming down her face now, her composure completely shattered. "Miss Hartwell, let me tell you something that I hope you'll remember during your time in prison. Your father's job, your family's money, your Yale degree. None of that makes you better than Robert Chen. None of that makes his life worth less than yours. He went to work every night, provided for his family, treated people with kindness, and lived a decent, honorable life. That is worth more than all the privilege you were born into. I hope that during your incarceration, you'll have time to reflect on that. I hope you'll come to understand that justice isn't about who you know or who your father is. It's about what you did and what the law requires." He raised his gavel, and in that moment before it fell, the entire room held its breath. "Court is adjourned. The defendant will be remanded into custody immediately to begin serving her sentence." The gavel struck the bench with a sound like thunder. 2 bailiffs moved forward to take Madison into custody. She was sobbing now, clutching at Pemberton's sleeve, saying, "Call my father, call him right now." But the attorney could only shake his head with a mixture of sympathy and professional detachment as the bailiffs guided her toward the door that led to the holding cells. She looked back at the courtroom once, her face a portrait of disbelief and devastation, before disappearing through the door. Judge Monroe remained at the bench as the courtroom slowly emptied. He looked at Mrs. Chen, who had stood with her children, and gave her a small nod of acknowledgement. She nodded back, fresh tears streaming down her face. But these were different tears, tears of vindication, of justice served, of knowing that her husband's life had mattered to someone, to this court, to the law. She and her family walked out with their heads high, knowing that while nothing could bring Robert back, at least the system had worked. At least the woman who killed him would face real consequences. In the hallway outside, reporters swarmed Pemberton, throwing questions at him like weapons. "Will the governor intervene? Is there going to be an appeal? What's your response to the sentence?" But Pemberton pushed through them without comment, his phone already pressed to his ear, no doubt calling the governor's office to deliver the news that privilege and power had met their match in Department 7. Judge Monroe gathered his papers slowly, methodically, with the same care he'd shown throughout the trial. A younger judge might have rushed out to avoid the media circus, but Elias Monroe had never run from anything in his life. He walked through his chambers, removed his robe, hung it with the same precision he brought to everything, and sat at his desk for a moment in the quiet. Through the window he could see the city beyond, the buildings and streets where millions of people lived their lives, went to work, raised their families, obeyed the laws, and expected that when something went wrong, the system would work. That was all they asked for. Fairness, equality, the knowledge that the law applied to everyone, not just the powerless. He thought about Madison Hartwell, now beginning a 30-year journey through the correction system. He thought about her father, the governor, who would no doubt face questions about this at his next press conference, who would have to explain why his daughter wasn't above the law, even though so many people assumed she would be. But mostly, he thought about Robert Chen, a man he'd never met, whose entire life had been summarized in court documents and witness statements, but whose dignity and value had been clear in every word. That was who this was for. Not for the spectacle, not for the media, not to make a political statement, but for Robert Chen and for every other ordinary person who deserved to know that their life mattered as much as anyone else's. The news cycle would move on eventually. The reporters would find new stories. Madison Hartwell would become a cautionary tale, a name people invoked when discussing privilege and justice. But in Department 7, things would continue as they always had. Cases would be heard, evidence would be weighed, and justice would be served without fear or favor, regardless of who stood before the bench. Because that was what Judge Elias Monroe had sworn to do 30 years ago when he took his oath. And that was what he would continue to do every single day until he retired. Not because it was easy, not because it made him popular, but because it was right. If this story reminded you that justice should be blind to privilege, power, and political connections, then hit that like button and subscribe to Court of Judge Monroe for more stories about real accountability. Drop a comment saying, "Justice for all," or tell us where you're watching from. Let's build a community that believes in equal justice under law, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who your father is, how much money you have, or what school you went to. What matters is what you did, what the law says, and whether you're willing to face the consequences of your actions. That's not just a legal principle, it's a moral one, and it's the foundation of any society that calls itself just. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.